Brothers and sisters, we receive many testimonies on this channel, but every once in a while one arrives that stops everything. That makes the team go quiet. That sends us to our knees before we can do anything else. This is that testimony. It is the account of Linda Toney, a cardiac nurse who worked for 38 years standing at the boundary between life and death, until the day her own heart stopped for 11 minutes and she was shown what is coming. She was taken beyond the veil and given specific dates, specific events, and a commission she did not ask for but cannot set down. She saw the financial collapse beginning May 24th. She saw two kinds of communities, one that had prepared but closed their doors, and another that opened theirs and watched their resources multiply. She saw a system that looked like salvation but required a declaration of ownership that could not be undone, and she was told to speak it while there is still time. We have been praying for Linda since her testimony reached us, and we will not stop. Please watch every word of this testimony. Please pray for this sister and for every person who will face the choice she was shown. Tell us where you are watching from so we can pray for your city too. And now please listen carefully. This one will stay with you.
My name is Linda Toney, and I spent 38 years working as a cardiac nurse. Day after day, I stood at that delicate line where life meets death, learning to read the signs when a heart begins to fail. I never thought I would find myself on the other side of that line, not in a way that would end in death, but in something I can only describe as an awakening. My life has been simple, built on quiet faith, regular scripture reading, and years that came and went without anything extraordinary. I never looked for what I'm about to tell you. But on March 15th, something happened that changed everything, and the clarity of it hasn't faded even slightly. It started like any other shift, ordinary and routine, until suddenly the pain hit, sharp and overwhelming. I knew immediately what was happening because I'd witnessed it so many times in my patients. My heart was failing. There was no time to be afraid, just the clear knowledge that something final had begun. Then the world around me began to fade, not chaotically, but with a strange sense of purpose, like a door closing with intention. Later, the doctors told me my heart had stopped for 11 minutes. I know what that means medically. I know how narrow the window is for bringing someone back. But those 11 minutes weren't nothing. They weren't lost time or empty space. They were the start of something beyond what we understand as life. The hospital sounds, voices, alarms, urgency, all pulled away as if someone had placed distance between me and that room. In an instant, without any transition, I was somewhere else. Fully conscious, fully there, but no longer connected to the body lying on that bed. There was no confusion, no panic. Just absolute certainty that I had crossed the threshold I'd watched others cross my entire career. I looked down at my hands. They were mine, but different, complete in a way I'd never experienced. Every limitation of normal vision seemed removed. I understood then what had always been hidden from us, that everything we see in this life is just a fraction of what's real. The scripture came to mind with new weight. Now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. I was no longer seeing in part. I had stepped into something that had always existed beyond the physical world. I wasn't alone. I knew my heart had stopped. I knew that somewhere, my colleagues were working to save me with the same training I'd used to save others. But that wasn't what was in front of me now. He was there, walking toward me across ground that seemed to glow. I won't describe what he looked like because words can't capture it. What I will say is this: when his eyes met mine, I felt completely known, not judged, not examined, known. Like someone had read every private thought, every unfinished prayer, every secret I'd kept, and understood it all completely. And none of it changed how he looked at me. His voice didn't come from one place, it filled everything. "Linda," he said, and hearing my name from him gave it meaning it had never had before. What I'm about to reveal to you isn't symbolic or figurative. It's not a metaphor you need to interpret. These are real events with real dates, and they're already set in motion. His voice carried absolute certainty. It will unfold in stages, and the first begins on May 24th. May 24th. As he spoke, the scene around us shifted. I was looking down at a place that seemed completely normal, highways, cities, morning light on an ordinary Tuesday, until it changed. What I noticed first wasn't destruction, it was stillness. ATMs along the East Coast stopped working. Not one by one or in stirs, but in a pattern that spread too quickly to be a simple technical problem. I watched the banking system the way I'd watched heart monitors when rhythms start to fail. Everything looked normal. The screens were on, numbers displayed, and then they weren't. "This isn't a hack in the usual sense," Jesus said. "What you're seeing is a chain reaction." Each failure triggers the next, and the system was never built to survive this particular sequence. I understood. I'd spent decades watching bodies fail in exactly this way. One system trying to compensate until the compensation itself causes the next breakdown. This was the same, except the body was massive and no one inside it realized the rhythm had already changed. The government's response came quickly, temporary, isolated, being resolved. I watched the official making the announcement the same way I'd watched doctors deliver difficult news to families, reading the face, not the words. What I saw was controlled composure, the look of someone managing something they don't fully grasp yet. Not lying, but managing panic. It wasn't temporary. By day 2, payments still weren't processing. Payroll systems dependent on the same network started failing. Trucking companies that needed electronic payments for fuel started parking their vehicles. Supply chains don't run on goods, they run on transactions. And the transactions had stopped like blood stops flowing when pressure drops too low. I watched people at gas stations standing at pumps that required cards. They checked their phones once, then again. I saw a man somewhere in Ohio make a call, wait, hang up, then just stand there, not panicking, but thinking hard and getting nowhere. That's when I started crying, not the distant tears you shed watching news from far away. I cried the way I once cried beside a patient I'd come to care for, knowing he was dying before his family did, unable to warn them in any way they'd be ready to hear. I watched a woman at a grocery store checkout somewhere in the mid-Atlantic region, standing with a full cart she couldn't pay for. Her face didn't show panic, just bewilderment, the specific confusion of someone discovering that the ground beneath a system she'd never questioned was never as solid as she'd believed. But the disasters weren't the main point. Before I could process the grief from what I'd just seen, everything shifted again. What he showed me next wasn't coastlines flooding or financial systems collapsing. He showed me the inside of faith communities. And within moments I understood this was what he most urgently wanted me to carry back. Not because the other disasters were less real, but because what happened inside these communities would determine whether anything worthwhile survived. He showed me 2 kinds of people, and the difference wasn't what I expected. The first group had prepared for everything. They had stockpiles of food and water, generators, backup plans. They could quote scripture to support every decision and had answers ready for every objection. Their readiness had become so hardened over time that it no longer needed God to animate it. When crisis came and neighbors showed up at their doors, those neighbors became problems to manage rather than people to love. I watched the calculations happening behind careful eyes. The logic wasn't wrong, exactly, but it had been worked out without the one factor that changes everything. Faith that protects only itself has already lost what it meant to protect. The second group had supplies too, about the same amount, sometimes less. But they'd gathered everything with different intentions, and those intentions shaped everything that followed. I watched a community of about 60 people across several neighboring properties, somewhere in rural Ohio or Indiana. They'd built relationships before they needed them. The community existed before crisis made community necessary. Because they already knew each other. They could absorb the pressure when more people came without breaking under the weight of sudden intimacy, with strangers who'd only become neighbors through disaster. The resources shouldn't have been enough, the math didn't add up. But 60 people ate, more came, they ate too. And I was crying, somehow crying without a face, but with the full weight of what tears mean. He watched them with an expression I couldn't quite name, though I'd spent nearly 40 years reading faces under stress. The closest word is tenderness, though that's not quite right, because tenderness implies the object is fragile. What he was watching wasn't fragile at all. The order matters, he told me. Faith is the foundation. Preparation grows from genuine faith. Community is the fruit that makes preparation visible to everyone around it. You can't reverse that order without creating something that looks right but has no life in it. These are mine, he said. The way he said it, not triumphant, not vindicated, just quietly certain, the way a father is certain about his own children, was the most painful and beautiful thing I witnessed the entire time I was there. The third vision surprised me most because at first it looked like a solution. The system had a name I couldn't quite remember when I came back, something bureaucratic and forgettable. But what it did was precise, and I watched it roll out in the weeks after the financial collapse. The infrastructure failure had made coordination impossible. Food couldn't be distributed. Medical resources couldn't reach people whose records didn't match any working database. This system solved everything. It used biometric identification tied to a person's physical body in a way no card or password could replicate. The procedure took less than 4 minutes and required only presence and consent. It worked. I watched it work. Supply chains stabilized where adoption rates were highest. Hospitals began functioning again with something close to normal coordination. People who'd stood in lines for 6 days finally ate. I watched the pastors. That's the part that weighs on me most. I recognized some of them, not their faces exactly, but the way they carried their authority. Their buildings had become distribution centers in the previous weeks, which was the right and faithful response. Now, they stood in those same buildings making the argument from those same pulpits. And they weren't being cynical. That's what I couldn't look away from. They believed what they were saying. This isn't the mark, they said, because Scripture describes something that can't come until certain conditions exist that aren't here yet. This is just logistics. This is how we feed the children in this room right now with the food in this building that requires verified recipients. Choosing doctrinal positions over the hunger of the person standing in front of you isn't faithfulness. It's pride wearing faithfulness like a coat. Families divided in ways that didn't heal. I watched a woman in what looked like a mid-sized city somewhere in the central part of the country have a conversation with her adult son that lasted less than 3 minutes. By the end, something between them had closed that had been open their entire lives. Neither was completely wrong about what they said. That was the specific quality of grief I felt watching it. The choice was never about the object itself, Jesus said. What accepting it required was a declaration, not spoken out loud, but made in the deep interior place where a person's ultimate allegiance actually lives, about who owns them. Declarations made in that place can't be revised by later arguments because they were never made by argument to begin with. The people who refused weren't all living their refusal well. I watched some survive physically but harden into something that had the shape of faithfulness without any of its warmth. That too was a loss he wanted me to understand. Why me? I asked him. I need to be honest, the question wasn't humble, it was desperate. The question of someone feeling the weight of a task settling on them that they're not sure they can carry. I have grandchildren who call on Sunday afternoons. I have a garden behind my house in Lagos that I've been trying to get right for 21 years and still haven't managed. My faith has been real, but quiet. Sometimes, I'll admit, it's been sleepy in the way faith can become when it's lived mostly in ordinary days without crisis. I've spent 4 decades reading monitors, adjusting IV lines, holding the hands of frightened people. And what I felt settling on me in that glowing place felt like something meant for someone completely different. When you return, he said, you must share everything you've witnessed. Not to build a following or to be believed for your own validation, but because the faithful who hear this and act while there's still time will have been given something they couldn't give themselves. Specific knowledge at the moment it's still useful. But who will believe me? I said. I'm not a minister. I have no platform, no credentials that make a vision believable to anyone who hasn't already decided to receive it. Some will, he said. That's enough. I didn't have time to respond. The return wasn't gentle. There was no gradual fading, no sense of leaving like walking out of a room. There was a single violent shock of electricity through my chest, the defibrillator, and my spirit and body slammed back together with force that felt like falling from an impossible height. The first breath burned outward from my chest in every direction. I heard voices before I could see faces, colleagues I'd worked beside for 16 years at St. Catherine's. Then the ceiling of Bay 4, the overhead light, and faces. Frightened and relieved in that specific combination cardiac nurses learn to carry for others but don't expect to receive. The first thing I noticed, before I could speak or before anyone confirmed how long I'd been gone, was that the visions hadn't faded. They were present with exactly the same clarity they'd had in that other place. The financial collapse on May 24th. The faces of the 2 kinds of communities. The biometric system and the arguments made for it from pulpits that had become distribution centers. Every detail was intact, ordered, precise, burning with the same sharpness it had when he showed it to me. I understood immediately this wasn't how memory works. These hadn't softened at all, and they weren't going to. I lay in that hospital bed with visions burning in my mind with precision I knew wasn't natural. And I understood the clarity itself was part of what I'd been given, because a messenger who can't remember the message exactly isn't ready to deliver it. I'm not a minister. I don't have a platform I'm trying to protect or build. What I have is the memory of what I was shown, the clarity of which hasn't diminished by a single degree since I came back. I have a commission I didn't ask for and can't in good conscience put down. If you've stayed with me through this entire account, I don't think that happened by accident. God doesn't waste attention. If this testimony found you, there's a reason. I'd ask you to sit with that before you move on to whatever's next. If you'd leave a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from, I'll be praying specifically for your area. Not generally, but by name, by place, with the specific urgency what I was shown deserves. The window I described isn't permanent. Prayer offered now, before events arrive, carries weight that prayer offered afterward can't fully carry. If this testimony has reached something in you, please subscribe so anything else I'm led to share will find you when it needs to. And do one more thing. Share this with someone you love, because a single act of passing this along can reach someone who's been waiting, without knowing it, to hear exactly this. If this testimony has touched something deep within you, don't ignore it. What touches the spirit rarely happens by chance, but is often a call to awaken while there's still time. Write in the comments where you're listening from so I can pray specifically for your city and for what's coming. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what will be shared next, because each message may arrive exactly when you need it most. Share this video with someone you love because you may be the very person through whom this truth reaches a ready heart. Don't delay what you feel right now because some doors remain open only for a time. Stay watchful, guard your faith, and prepare your heart.